Welcome to the event on Stepping Up Adaptation to Climate Change in the Decade of Action, convened by the Delegation of the European Union, the permanent missions of Antigua and Barbuda, Mozambique and Portugal, and the Alliance of Small Island States. My name is Adriana Dinu. I work with UNDP, and I will be the moderator of today's session. Before we open the event, let me remind everyone of a few housekeeping rules. May I remind all participants to please mute your microphones unless you're taking the floor, and use the chat function to ask questions or to indicate your desire to to take the floor in the questions and answer part of the session. Thank you so much. So the objective of our event today is to identify pathways to address some of the key challenges around adaptation, building on good practices and lessons learned, with a particular focus on adaptation in small island developing states and least developed countries. With the Climate and Biodiversity Conference of Parties converging this year amidst the continued threat of the pandemic, and as we just enter the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, 2021 will be the ultimate test of our collective commitment to people and planet. The message that is coming out is very clear. We need to address climate change and biodiversity loss together, and we need to address them now. In this historic year, adaptation is not only central to the nature climate priorities set by member states, but also to an inclusive, resilient, and green recovery from COVID-19. Transformative adaptation action requires fully infusing climate across national and subnational development and investment policies and decisions into every major sector. And it requires us to harness the full spectrum of private and public climate finance sources. The needs and priorities we all know are especially acute for seeds and LDCs. While they are on the front lines of climate impacts with extremely vulnerable populations, they are also the front runners on the adaptation planning. Many seeds and LDCs now have strong adaptation components of their revised national determined contributions, are accelerating their national adaptation plans processes, and have already demonstrated integrated planning on climate change adaptation in key sectors of their economies, such as food systems, agriculture, tourism. Though unique in their exposure and vulnerabilities to climate change, seeds and LDC experience can serve as an important center of knowledge transfer for our country's journeys towards a green recovery. With that in mind, I now want to turn to our distinguished speakers for their opening remarks. I would like to invite His Excellency, Permanent Representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the United Nations and Chair of EOSIS, Dr. Walton A. Webson. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Adriana. Madam Moderator, Excellencies, colleagues, the government of Antigua and Barbuda is chairing the Alliance of Small Island States, EOSIS, and we are pleased to co-host this important event. Small islands are on the front line of the climate change. My friends, you have heard us say that time and time again. Our financial, social, environmental, and governance systems are already being severely impacted. The true cost of climate inaction and the principle of polluters pay are not at work here. Our communities are self-financing adaptation. Climate finance is not reaching the most vulnerable in pace with the climate impacts. The first barrier is that we are not accurately tracking what government and our local private sectors are already spending to already cope with the 1.2 degrees Celsius of global warming that we find ourselves in now. For example, during a severe drought, a recent survey showed that householders, primarily in rural areas, can pay between 100 to 300 US dollars each month to purchase portable water from private companies, in addition to ongoing monthly payments, maintaining connection to the utility companies. But let me put that in perspective or in some context so that we can get this. 100 or 300 US dollars may sound like a little bit of money, and in some contexts we know it's a lot. But 100 US dollars is in Eastern Caribbean dollars is $260, or 300 is $800 plus dollars. So you're asking an individual, if they're paying $800, to pay about a third of their income in some cases. Hurricane preparedness is more expensive, costing a householder nearly 2,000 US dollars per year, just in preparedness, not in post-disaster economies, not after a hurricane might have hit. This is in preparation for. These are the hidden costs of climate change that the world is overlooking, that you don't often hear about. These expenses are not for economic growth or prosperity. They are to offset the cost of living in a more extreme climate. Climate change is making it harder for us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So what can we do about this? We often say more climate finance is needed, but most importantly, and predictable climate finance must go directly to the vulnerable householders and the communities, to help them finance their ongoing cost of adaptation at the local levels from the bottom up. Climate funds must be simplified and be easy to access, to finance, especially via direct access for climate vulnerable, small island and least developed countries. In Antigua and Barbuda, we have piloted and scaled up a fund to pass on concessional climate finance to householders and the small businesses for adaptation, like things like water storage, landscaping, and previously green cover hurricane areas, and shutters for your homes, and solar energy with batteries. And yet, evidence and our experience has proved that smaller, innovative projects face more hurdles in the approval process to get funding. We need to fix this at the level of institutions. Climate finance is increasingly important for vulnerable communities, but the total dollar amount is really dwarfed by regular financial flows. Many know for the $100 billion, we all know about this 100 billion climate finance goal. But I want you to contrast this with the long struggle to reach this goal with the fact that more than 189 billion of G7's combined economic recovery funds were spent in fossil fuels during this pandemic recovery, despite pledges to cut emissions. I want you to pause and think about that for a moment. The struggle for 1 billion that we have been facing and the almost 200 billion spent, 2 billion spent by G7 countries in the last, just in this recovery. AOSIS is asking all of us together to ensure that all policy investments and budget decisions consider climate resilience and a 1.5 degree pathway at this time. Combined emissions to get targets are taking us towards 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And yet, regular infrastructure is still being built without budgeting the additional costs of climate resilience, without assessing climate risks or stress testing. Colleagues, excellencies, making all financial decisions consist of the goals of the Paris Agreement will deliver a swifter, a systematic shift, much faster, channeling concessional and grant-based climate finance directly to the vulnerable the bottom line communities and will ensure that no one is left behind. We cannot afford to lose any more time. I thank you.
Excellency, thank you very much. Indeed, climate change is jeopardizing the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the cost is borne by the most vulnerable. Thank you for highlighting how climate finance needs to be predictable, but needs to reach the most vulnerable. And the climate resilience should be included in all policy and investment decisions. So thank you very much for your statement. I would like now to invite His Excellency, Permanent Representative of Mozambique to the United Nations, Mr. Pedro Comisario Afonso. Ambassador.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank and pay tribute to my colleagues in the panel for this excellent initiative to talk about adaptation in the decade of action for SDGs. Adaptation is a major responsibility of the present generations. The way we approach today will also have major consequences to future generations. This is to say that adaptation represents a real challenge to the implementation of the SDGs. Climate change is a clear and present danger that threatens our sacred goals of ending poverty, of rescuing the planet, and of building a peaceful world in an inclusive manner that leaves no one behind. This is the reason why adaptation is not just a global goal of the international community. It is also a global responsibility. It is a shared responsibility of humankind. Because, as one poet put it, no man is an island. No country, for that matter, is an island. Having said that, let me be less abstract and bring into the picture the case of my own country, Mozambique. Ours is an extremely vulnerable country to the effects of climate change. Statistically, we are thought to be one of the most exposed countries in the world to extreme climate events and natural disasters. Previously unknown phenomena are now familiar to our people. They include fluctuation of temperatures and precipitation patterns, the sea level rise, extreme climate events, and so on. Many factors concur to explain this condition of vulnerability. Geographical location, which is prone to tropical cyclones, low capacity to adapt, limited investment in modern technologies, fragility of infrastructures and social services. You will recall that in 2019, Mozambique was hit by two devastating cyclones, namely Idai and Kenneth. They claimed many human lives and caused enormous damages to socioeconomic infrastructures, leaving thousands of people without shelter and their productive assets. 2 years have gone by, but we are still dealing with the terrible consequences of the destruction. Faced with this situation, the government of Mozambique has adopted in 2021 the National Strategy for the Adaptation and Mitigation of Climate Changes. In 2020, the government had approved a law on disaster management and risk reduction. As part of its commitment to better address the climate change effects on a regional level, Mozambique has offered to host the SADC Humanitarian and Emergency Operations Center located in Nacala, in the northern part of the country. The main purpose is to enhance regional capabilities in risk and disaster management, including those related to climate changes. Well, now what is to be done? In summary, I think that we need to take some action, collective action. First, it is our strong belief that common threats entail common action. In this connection, we think cooperation, international cooperation, is a key to adaptation, particularly for our developing nations. Second, investment. Our countries, I mean developing countries, in general, are lands of opportunity. Adaptation can be translated into many business opportunities. Third, need for mobilizing additional, more financial resources to rebuild forward better. And these are my comments. Thank you very much.
Excellency, thank you. We really salute Mozambique's leadership on the national strategy for adaptation and mitigation, and the importance of risk and disaster risk management in considering adaptation. But perhaps what you said at the beginning, taking adaptation as a shared responsibility, I think it resonates with all of us here. And I think that's in fact one of the key objectives of this event. So thank you so much. I would like now to invite His Excellency, Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, Mr. Olof Skog, to take the floor. Excellency.
Thank you very much, Adriana, and to UNDP for the work you're doing on this issue. And I want to say that I'm very, very glad to co-host this event together with Mozambique and Antigua, Barbuda, and also the Portugal as EU presidency. And I thought the two interventions we've just heard from our dear colleagues from Mozambique and Antigua, Barbuda really gives a good background, as they speak with such credibility about how the stark realities of countries and regions that are really at the worst suffering when it comes to the havoc of climate change. 2021 has the possibility of being the year where we finally gain, more attention and more traction on adaptation. It started in January with the first Global Adaptation Summit in the Netherlands, and we know that the United Kingdom as host to the Glasgow COP26 is making this a key priority of that COP. On the EU side, we have presented a new adaptation strategy in February, which all 27 member states endorsed last week. You will hear more about this later today. Our political engagement on adaptation shows also in the process of submitting to the UNFCCC an EU adaptation communication under the Paris Agreement. We need adaptation across the globe. The impacts of climate change are too serious to spare anyone. Addressing the climate challenge will profoundly change the texture of our economies, societies, and partnerships everywhere. We know that it can provide opportunities if it's handled correctly. But for that, we need to put adaptation and get adaptation right. We've just heard some examples of everything we need to reflect on, including from Ambassador Webson, giving some very stark example of the hidden costs and the additional costs that comes from the effects of climate change. So we need specific attention for making sure that our actions reach the most vulnerable populations and meet the needs of local communities. And it has to be a joint effort, as the Ambassador of Mozambique said. That is why it's so important to have discussions like the one today with representatives, including from SIDS and LDCs. You will hear the panel on how we can progress on adaptation, planning, and mobilization of finance. More broadly, all financial flows must be aligned with climate mitigation and adaptation objectives. This is the key enabler for achieving the Paris goals. And even more than we are doing already, adaptation, as all climate action, must not be an area of expert discussions or for environment ministers only. We really need political leadership at the highest level. And we must embed adaptation and disaster risk reduction considerations in all relevant policies, from macroeconomic to sectoral. Finally, let's not forget how closely effective adaptation action is linked to the biodiversity agenda. As the joint IPCC and IPBES report of last week has underlined again, climate change and biodiversity loss are existential threats, and we cannot afford any trade-offs in our actions. The right nature-based solutions are a key pathway forward for tackling both of these challenges jointly. So to conclude, on the way to and in Glasgow, we need ambition both on mitigation and adaptation. The EU, I think, has this ambition, and we want to work with our partners to ensure that the transition to a climate neutral and resilient world with increased global preparedness is an option for all, and that we leave no one behind. Thank you very much, Adriana.
Thank you so much, Excellency. I would really like to congratulate the European Union on its adaptation strategy. You've been setting an example both through the external engagement as well as internal action on advancing climate change adaptation. We look forward for the EU adaptation communications. We really want to emphasize that indeed all financial flows have to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, with the climate change mitigation and adaptation, and any business case for adaptation should also reflect the hidden costs. So thank you so much. Now I would like to invite His Excellency, Permanent Representative of Portugal to the United Nations, Mr. Francisco Duarte Lopez. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Adriana. It's a pleasure to co-organize this event with AOSIS, Antigua and Barbuda, Mozambique, and and the European Union. And it's also a pleasure to be here with my dear colleagues and friends, Ambassadors Webson, Comissário Afonso, and Scope. And I would like to start by thanking everybody following this event today. Our idea for this event is to try to help putting adaptation to climate change where it really belongs, at the center of the UN agenda. Mitigation efforts are, of course, critical. Climate impacts are already here. Extreme weather events are becoming increasingly frequent and intense. We all remember the words of Secretary General Guterres, who said that adaptation must not be the forgotten component of climate action. But for our adaptation efforts to work, we need effective planning. And we need, of course, adequate financing, as it was very well spotlighted and referred to by the ambassadors of Antigua and Barbuda and Mozambique. As one of the European countries most affected by climate change, Portugal has had successive adaptation strategies over the years, and we have now started practical work on our national roadmap for adaptation, with 2100 as our horizon. Over the years, one of our focuses has been international cooperation through joint actions with several Mediterranean countries and neighboring countries, contributing to knowledge sharing on climate adaptation and various adaptation projects in priority partner countries, namely in Africa. The climate-water nexus is high on our agenda, as water is becoming an increasingly scarce resource. And let me highlight as well the important role that the ocean can play in our adaptation efforts, for instance, through the establishment of marine protected areas. Let me also stress that adaptation has been among the priorities of Portugal's rotating presidency of the European Union Council, which is now entering its last weeks. As Ambassador Sco just mentioned, the European Union new adaptation strategy was endorsed last week by the 27 member states of the EU. And in this occasion, the European Union reconfirmed our commitment to further scale up mobilization of finance and to strengthen global engagement and exchanges on adaptation. The green and blue dimensions have been at the fore of our agenda. And I would like to highlight the high-level EU-Africa Green Investment Forum in April that we co-organized with the European Investment Bank. This event was preceded by a month of almost daily green talks organized in several EU and African capitals. In total, the green talks and the forum had more than 10,000 participants, showcasing the green transition as an effective opportunity to create jobs and reduce inequalities. To conclude, let me just say that adaptation has an important place in our narrative on climate change, which we must all bring to life together. I hope that this event today can be a small step in this direction. Thank you again, Adriana.
Thank you so much, Excellency. We would really like to congratulate Portugal for its leadership on adaptation issues, but also for really highlighting the importance of the climate-water nexus and the role of ocean and conservation and nature-based solutions. I might be subjective. This is a topic very dear to my heart, the marine protected areas and its role and the role of international cooperation. So thank you so much. We are now, we heard about the EU strategy on adaptation. I think you are all very curious. And so I'm going to turn now to Ms. Elena Bartram, Acting Director, International Mainstreaming and Policy Coordination at DG Clima at European Commission, to present the EU Adaptation Strategy. Ms. Bartram, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adriana. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, who I see many on this call, it's a real pleasure to join you today. And I think, this kind of conversation, our alliances between North and South, between EU and the other progressive countries will become increasingly important as we approach the crunch time of COP26. And we will really need to join forces in ambition in order to push for those laggards who still exist to get across the finishing line in terms of mitigation, but very importantly, the adaptation objectives and the climate finance objectives that have been mentioned by the previous speakers. And I fully subscribed to the messages that were transmitted there. As you see, I'm joining you from the home office in Brussels. We're still in semi-confinement, but it's nevertheless a real pleasure to take part in this effort and this event on climate change adaptation and sustainable development goals. As we know, in 2019, summer heat wave caused 2,500 deaths in Europe. No region is immune to the impacts of climate change. By 2050, up to 143 million people are expected to migrate due to climate change in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America alone. Climate change is also an important driver of biodiversity loss, because biodiversity loss, we also have the so-called buffering species that are disappearing. And new pathogens are increasingly crossing over between animals and humans. We ignored the warnings of SARS, MERS, and Ebola, but I think we are all realizing that there is a connection between these pandemics and the situation that we have with the deteriorating climate. Climate change and environmental degradation are unfolding in front of our very eyes, and they are putting our economic models in question. So how important is adaptation in this context? Our fight against the climate crisis demands, first of all, that we avoid catastrophe, and that is why we reduce emissions. Our EU commitment is to reduce emissions by at least 55% by 2030 and to become climate neutral by 2050. But our fight also involves to prepare for the unavoidable effects of past and current emissions. That is why adaptation policies must be essential and an integral element of our climate action. And in the European Union, we're doing this, but it also applies to our partner countries. The very existence of some of our partners, like some of the small island developing states, is at stake here. The EU's new adaptation strategy on climate change will complement Europe's climate neutrality by 2050. It will ensure that by 2050, we are also climate resilient. For this, the strategy will guide adaptation that is smarter, more systemic, and faster. In addition, it will give a new impetus to our international climate action on adaptation. First, to make adaptation smarter, we need more data collection and data sharing. With more precise modeling on the future hazards, farmers can better plan the crops they plant. Families buying a house will know what climate risks they may face. Businesses will know how to make new production facilities fit for a hotter planet. Cities will know how to protect residents from massive storm surges or floods. Preparedness knowledge is really key here. Second, to make adaptation more systemic, we will target more support at local level. We will also tailor advice and support for the most vulnerable communities so that they can find the expertise to plan and the resources to take action. We will promote nature-based solutions. They are efficient, value for money, and provide not only for adaptation, but also for biodiversity, clean air, and cool and vibrant cities. Thirdly, to make adaptation faster, we need to bridge the gap between planning and implementation. For this, we will work with the European Investment Bank to boost adaptation financing. We will also intensify our collaboration with the insurance sector and prioritize water management and the water, energy, food nexus. Fourth, and this is very, very important for us, we need to do more at the international level. Our climate change adaptation policies must match our global leadership in climate change mitigation. The Paris Agreement established a global goal on adaptation and highlighted adaptation as a key contributor to sustainable development. It is clear that commitments on climate finance will play an important role for a successful COP in Glasgow this year and beyond. The EU has consistently lived up to our responsibilities here. We already spent about half of our development finance on projects that support at the same time development and adaptation to climate change. Team Europe, the partnership between EU and member states on development cooperation, has consistently contributed $25 billion over the 3 last years. In this way, we are major contributors to the common objective of the 100 billion goal or target of climate financing per year. And we will renew our commitment on climate finance at the COP26 in Glasgow. To conclude, we hear the stark warnings from the scientific community. We also hear your messages, your voices. We see the impacts of climate change in the news and in our streets, our beaches, our farms, and also the evidence from the very vulnerable communities and countries that face already developmental challenges. At the same time, we're seeing public money devoted to ensure to a recovery that must be green, and we want it to last. All this makes today, now, the pivotal moment to implement adaptation. In doing so, we will not only protect our citizen and the citizen of the world from climate impacts and avoid losses, but we will also draw extra dividends in terms of major social, environmental, and economic benefits. I think it is very important that the EU and the progressive countries join forces to fight for this agenda on the occasion of COP26, and we are here to support that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bartram. The strategic directions indicated in the EU strategy on adaptation are indeed contributing. We'll see how they could contribute to make adaptation smarter, swifter, more systemic, and contribute to step up international action on adaptation. It's very interesting how aligned is also with the COP26 priorities in terms of adaptation, focus on communities and natural habitats, mobilizing finance, and also working together to deliver. So once again, congratulations on that. We are now proceeding with the panel discussion. And the panel discussion will focus on addressing 2 persistent challenges in stepping up adaptation in this decade. Namely, first, not enough inclusive and integrated adaptation planning that helps identify priorities and promotes effective adaptation actions and synergies, as the distinguished speakers identified. Synergies between 2030 Agenda, Paris Agreement, Sendai Framework, New Urban Agenda, and Addis Ababa Financing for Development, and of course, the 3 UN Rio Conventions. Second key challenge that we need to address is related to limited mobilization of public and private finance for adaptation measures. There is a good business case for adaptation finance, as we heard, but it is important to understand how to scale up both public and private resources devoted to adaptation actions. And in particular now, in the context of COVID-19, by directing the trillions of dollars of recovery stimulus to areas such as social protection, education, transforming food and commodity production, low carbon growth, and so on. We do have an impressive panel today with speakers representing government, finance, and business sector. I would like to ask each member of the panel to keep their interventions to 3 minutes so we can have time to engage with the audience. So our first panel member is my dear friend, Jessica Troni, Head of Climate Change Adaptation Unit and Ecosystem Divisions at the United Nations Environmental Programme. Jessica, you have been working on climate adaptation in UN for more than 14 years. And in the past 5 years, we've been working together, UNDP and UNEP, on collaborating on national adaptation planning support to countries. So in your experience, Jessica, what is the role of planning in scaling up adaptation? And what are some of the lessons learned from UNEP's own experience in mobilizing finance for adaptation? Over to you.
Thank you, Adriana, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to our distinguished excellencies and friends in the conversation. I'm talking to you from Nairobi, where it is getting late, but it's a pleasure to join you in this conversation. Adriana, would it be possible just to share a few slides? It might be easier for people to focus on the screen. Is that permitted?
I think I'm going to ask the organizers if you do have the share screen. Let me see. Yes, you are the co-host, so you can share.
Oh, okay, great. All right. Let's see if this works. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. I will be very quick.
Slideshow. Yes, now it's better.
Okay, be very quick. So I wanted to bring your attention to the Adaptation Gap Report that was published late last year, where we noted that 2020 was one of the warmest on record, with more than 50 million people affected by droughts, floods, storms, and fires. And the important point being that if we take the mitigation measures, the commitments and the NDCs, and if we implement those, that future warming would be at least 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the end of the year, which is very bad news indeed, because what we're projecting is that at a 2-degree temperature change, we could expect damages to world product of up to 2.7% of GDP. But the good news is that adaptation can significantly reduce these damages. Adaptation costs in developing countries run into the hundreds of billions of dollars annually. So the question is, given what we know, why are we not adapting or adapting fast enough? And the reason, in my view, is that there are many barriers. It's not just financial barriers, but it's all the barriers that basically mean that all financing sources in an economy are not building resilience. So it's informational barriers, awareness barriers, capacity barriers, political, institutional. Lack of institutional coordination is a classic one. And that is where national adaptation planning processes come into importance. They're very important. This is just a snapshot of where UNEP is supporting 18 developing countries with their national adaptation planning processes, with another 15 in the pipeline. And really what we're focusing on is strengthening the science-based national adaptation plans, because countries need to be focusing on medium to long-term climate change risks in order to be able to plan for adaptation over the medium 5 to 20-year time frame. Supporting countries to develop ideas of what alternative strategies could be. Supporting countries with institutional coordination processes, not only horizontal, but also vertical integration between different stakeholder groups. The Adaptation Gap Report in 2020 reported that most developing countries now have at least one national adaptation planning instrument, and increasingly a sizable percentage have sectoral instruments. But the quality of the planning varies considerably. Integration across governance levels, vertical, is low, although it's better across sectors. implementation capacity is limited, limited finance, project management skills, and only a quarter of countries make use of regulatory instruments, such as building codes, standards, obligations, zoning, spatial planning, disclosure obligations, and even fewer use incentives such as taxes or subsidies to encourage adaptation action. And that is really important for the private sector. So why are we not investing in nature-based solutions for adaptation? I want to also draw your attention to this report that was published a couple of weeks ago, The State of Finance for Nature. Just a few key messages there. The world has lost half its forests, half its coral reefs. I think that's 50% of wetlands, dammed 2/3 of the world's main rivers, and wildlife populations have declined by 70% since 1970. 12 million hectares annually is becoming degraded, in addition to the 2 billion hectares that are already degraded. And 1.3 billion people are trapped on this degrading agricultural land. And yet, the financial system depends on nature. Out of 1.4 billion euros analysed, a third of that was lent or invested in sectors with high dependence on ecosystems. Many vulnerable communities depend on healthy ecosystems for their livelihoods. Currently, it's estimated that $133 billion currently flows into nature-based solutions, with public funds financing most of that. Conservative estimates suggest that we need to triple that by 2030 if the world is going to meet its climate change, biodiversity, and land degradation targets, which means that public sector finance cannot cover those needs. We need to be looking at private sector finance. But what is the issue here? The issue is twofold. It's to do with pricing. Private costs are not priced into the cost of consuming environmental goods and services. In other words, negative externalities are not paid for. And the public benefits of nature-based solutions are unrewarded. We know what they are, we have a good idea about what they are, but we are not pricing them into decisions on public sector financing, policies and regulations. So what this report is saying is that government action is critical in putting in place a policy regulatory framework that supports revenue streams from nature-based solutions, phases out harmful subsidies, and puts more into land use planning and expanding and protecting protected areas. This is most relevant to adaptation and adaptation planning, because what it means is that we need to develop an understanding of the role of nature in resilience to climate change adaptation, develop an understanding of what the threat of climate change is to nature and adaptation strategies, and accordingly adapt policy planning, regulatory, fiscal frameworks. I just want to finish up on this. Nature-based solutions, a social, economic and environmental winner. There are many statistics like this. I have just put a few up on the screen. Restoration of grasslands and woodlands have been shown to have a benefit to cost ratio of up to 1 to 35 and internal rates of return of 20 to 60%. And mangroves reduce wave height by as much as 66% over 100 meters of forest, providing a vital buffer against the impacts of storms, tsunamis and hurricanes. And just two very different countries, New Zealand and Malawi, that are investing in reforestation programs with the aim also of job creation. And we have lots of examples of this. South Africa also is a really good example of this. So I don't know if that's my 3 minutes or if it's 5 minutes, but I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your patience, Adriana.
Okay, thank you so much, Jessica. If you, okay, good. I will turn now to Gareth Phillips, Manager, Climate and Environment Finance, African Development Bank Group. Gareth, you have been working on climate change and sustainability for over 25 years, with a particular focus on innovative finance, and looking now at business cases for adaptation and the adaptation benefits mechanisms. Could you please reflect in particular on the challenges you see in mobilizing public and private finance for adaptation in your experience? Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Adriana. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Actually, to start off with, I disagree that there is a good business case for adaptation at the current time, and I'm going to come back to that point a little bit later on. I want to make 2 points. First of all, politically, adaptation may be on a par with mitigation, but financially, it is vastly underfunded, as we've heard. There are many sustainable sources of finance to support mitigation in both developed and developing countries. I don't have time to list them here, but in contrast, there are only a handful of sources of finance for adaptation. There's the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Green Climate Fund, and some bilateral and philanthropic funds. And they mostly provide grants to the public sector. Secondly, whilst the mitigation task facing us is huge, it is at least quantifiable. And by 2050, we will hopefully have largely addressed the challenge. The scale of adaptation needs, on the other hand, is unknown, and it is growing every day due to ongoing emissions and locked-in impacts of historic emissions and feedback loops. The impact of climate change on humanity is going to be bigger next year than it is this year. Adaptation needs will grow for decades to come. We are at the very thin end of a very big wedge. Now, thirdly, the Global Commission on Adaptation, and indeed Jessica in her presentation highlighted the benefits associated with adaptation projects. The GCA quote, $1 invested in adaptation yields $4 in benefits. However, it is very important to note that these are economic benefits and not financial benefits. And in my view, this is the crux of the problem. Most adaptation projects yield economic returns and not financial returns. And quite simply, the private sector cannot invest in economic returns. We have to solve this problem, otherwise, in my view, we will never mobilize the necessary resources for adaptation. So one solution would be for developed countries and those that can afford to do so, to communicate a willingness to pay for economic benefits of adaptation projects, and under Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, report those payments as contributions to the adaptation needs of developing countries. Now, in fact, we did something very similar to this in the late 1990s when developed countries communicated a willingness to pay for mitigation through the Kyoto Protocol. This commitment revolutionized the renewable energy sector by introducing a new source of cash flow that made economically attractive renewable energy projects financially competitive with fossil fuels. So we are calling on developed countries to do something similar for adaptation. And we think that if we communicate a willingness to pay for adaptation, then the private sector will engage, and they will bring with them innovation and entrepreneurship. They will bring finance and land and labor and indigenous knowledge and biodiversity, because these are the ingredients of the majority of adaptation projects in Africa, in LDCs and in SIDS. And this brings me to my last point. The project development ecosystems for adaptation and mitigation are completely different. For the vast majority of adaptation projects, project developers are micro, small and medium enterprises. They are communities and cooperatives, women, young people, farmers and fishers. These are the people who will invest in and implement adaptation projects in Africa and in LDCs and in SIDS. The problem is they don't talk to the international private finance community. They don't talk to institutions like the Green Climate Fund. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to find new ways of channeling money to these people to help them address the needs of adaptation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gareth. I would like now to turn the floor to our next panelist, Courtney Bailey, Technical Advisor at the Department of Environment at Antigua and Barbuda. Courtney, looking in your bio, I saw that your PhD at the Imperial College London Centre for Environmental Policy is focused on increasing private finance for climate resilient infrastructure in Caribbean SIDS. And you also co-chair the finance working group of the Independent Global Stocktake. So from your experience at the country level, as well as from a SIDS perspective, can you please reflect on how integrated planning can help improve mobilization of public and private finance? Over to you.
Oh, thank you, Adriana, and thank you for having me. I'll first have to apologize for the background noise. It's currently raining here, so it's quite loud if you hear any thunder or rain. But I think it's probably quite fitting as we're addressing adaptation itself. And right now in the Caribbean, we are currently in the hurricane season, which always highlights the need for adaptation planning and more specifically, mobilization of finance for adaptation. But yes, as you said, I focus on trying to increase private adaptation finance for Caribbean SIDS. And for us, one of the biggest challenges around adaptation planning is knowing how much finance we have access to. And you heard in the beginning mention of having predictable finance. Because of where we're situated, our experiences, we're quite accustomed to climate-related disasters. And to some extent, the case for adaptation is clear. However, our challenge is moving beyond concept implementation, and that is limited by our access to finance and limited access to finance. What I've seen in my work, but also looking at how we approach adaptation planning, one of the barriers to that is actually poor planning. One of the barriers to mobilizing finance is poor planning. And that poor planning, that doesn't just stop at the concept phase, but transcends to one of the critical phases, which is the project appraisal phase. So that lack of an integrated approach, which you mentioned, Adriana, that limits our ability to accurately capture and represents the benefits of adaptation, which Garrett so nicely put as termed as being mainly economic benefits. I say this because oftentimes you look at adaptation as being very locale specific, as in the benefits are only being restricted to the specific location or catchment area within which it's being implemented. However, if we start taking an integrated approach to adaptation planning, identifying systemic and macroeconomic benefits, we can facilitate mobilization of finance in more effective ways by firstly building the business case for adaptation locally. And Garrett alluded to this, which is the business case is not perfectly made for adaptation. In a lot of developing countries, we still have to gain the political capital to advance adaptation projects and make sure that we have the public finance to back the funding that we receive. And a lot of decision makers are usually still more concerned with the socioeconomic benefits than the resilience benefits and how those are communicated currently. But I think if we start blending and linking adaptation to macroeconomic factors, which is what most politicians speak and decision makers speak, we can facilitate the mobilization of domestic funds for adaptation, or domestic finance for adaptation, and by building that business case locally. But also, speaking from the perspective of a small and developing state, our domestic budgets are constrained, and we're amongst those with the highest public debt. And our access to capital is also limited given our economic classification as high, middle. A lot of the Caribbean SIDS are classified as middle to upper income and high income countries, and that limits our access to concessional financing. Now, for us the challenge for adaptation comes about with the cost of capital challenge and addressing that. Because of our high exposure to climate change, our risk perception is very high. Therefore, we have high interest rates. Now, if we started to take that integrated approach locally, where we start linking those macroeconomic benefits, but then not just locally, not just limiting the integrated approach to adaptation planning specifically, but how we finance and conduct decision-making for adaptation, whereby we take into account these resilience benefits or dividends, as you so kindly termed. There's potential to address that cost of capital challenge, whereby instead of the risk being taken as, leading to capital flight, the actions that we're investing in, and if those are considered, that can help to reduce our risk and give us easier or greater access or lower cost of capital going forward. And I think one of the most interesting things that we have to do is when we look at climate finance flows globally or flows to developing countries, it's quite evident that the private sector is needed to bridge the implementation gap to fill the adaptation finance gap. And I do believe that this integrated approach, we have the SDGs, we have the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. As Garrett said, if we use these economic or socioeconomic indicators and metrics and translate them in a way in financial terms that the financial sector and private sector are able to understand, I think that is when we will definitely see the increase in private finance that we need. And we see a lot of institutions working on this. For example, the World Bank, a lot of resilience metrics and initiatives are taking up this approach. And this is what we need developing countries to do. And in Antigua, we're taking that sort of integrated approach, hoping that it would increase investment and increase finance for adaptation, whereby as part of the NAP process, we conducted a risk mapping and modeling exercise. And that was to help us in identifying where we need to invest money, what communities are most vulnerable, and inform our decision-making going forward. And as I said, this can be tricky because if it's not done in the correct way, it can lead to capital flight. But we need to take an integrated approach to planning and financing the financial considerations in terms of allocating financing and funding for adaptation in developing countries to make sure that when countries take an integrated approach to planning by highlighting and identifying risks, we don't scare off the private sector and other investors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Now I would like to invite Claudio de Jesus, Chairman, Aguas de Portugal Internacional. Claudio.
Thank you, Adriana. I will try to share my screen before. Okay. I have a presentation. Are you seeing? Okay.
Yes, all good. You can put it in the slideshow mode.
Yeah, okay. Good. So, thank you for the invitation, ladies and gentlemen. Let me present our company. We are a public entity, belong to the Portuguese government. Some key indicators: we have a representation. We serve 8 million people, around 80% of the Portuguese population, with water and wastewater services, managing 13 regional companies, some figures regarding water produced and wastewater treated, and some financial indicators also. We have around 3,400 employees, and we are quite committed with the SDGs. We joined the United Nations Global Compact in 2010, and the Global Compact Network locally, and also the Alliance for Sustainable Development Goals, and the joint statement to the right to sanitation also. And in our international activities, we try to capitalize our group experience, know-how, and technological solutions in training in capacity building, strategic studies, planning and investing, operation and maintenance, and also water and wastewater service management, trying to find contracts in foreign countries financed by multilateral institutions like the World Bank, African Development Bank, European Union, Asian Development Bank, etc. So I would try to focus my presentation into two different projects that we managed. One regarding planification, and the other one regarding adaptation actions. One is the technical assistance to the Dili in East Timor in 2017, the Dili Drainage and Sanitation Master Plan. And the other one is His Excellency Pedro, sorry, Mr. Pedro Comissário Afonso, well explained the humanitarian aid project regarding the response to calamities caused by cyclones Idai and Kenneth in 2019 in Mozambique. So the first one, the Dili Sanitation and Drainage Sanitation Master Plan, our intention was to mitigate flooding events and increase service levels to the population. served by a sanitation collection and treatment system in line with the strategic development plan set by the government of East Timor. Some figures that, as you can see, without planification, and after that without the construction of infrastructures, they can have more, have good planification and good conditions, good conditions of living. Phase 1, and especially the phase 2, with the objectives, topographic, hydraulic modeling, detailed engineering and design of the drainage and of network of the city, detailed engineering and design of community sewage treatment systems, a lot of capacity building with our engineers and the local teams, and also the update of drainage master plan and the sanitation master plan. This is the first example that I want to give you. And the second one, very well known, the catastrophic that happens in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, leaving more than 1,300 people dead and much more missed. Our team went to Mozambique to support the Mozambican authorities in restoring the supply of drinking water to the populations. In close coordination with the Mozambican authorities, we prepared an action plan that consisted in 3 axes. First, assessment of the needs for rebuilding water and supply system in affected areas. Second axis, support for the restoration of water supply systems. And third axis, supply of reagents for water disinfection. With a multidisciplinary and motivated teams with 19 specialists in the field from our companies, we identified and classified the interventions in priority short-term and medium-term. And in the city of Beira, the most affected city, our experts identified 90 reconstruction and recovery measures corresponding to an investment of $12 million US. And finally, the results were the improvement in the quality of water supplied to the population, the recovery and startup of small compact water treatment facilities in Buzi, a small village, supply of reagents for water disinfection, and most important, supply of drinking water to around 3,000 families in the installation of water collection and treatment system, and a mobile water treatment plant that was a donation of one of our companies. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudio. If you can stop sharing. Yes. Excellent. Yeah. So thank you. I really like that you showed us examples of what's happening at the country level. So in fact, you have 20 years of experience, 28 years of experience in the operation of water supply and sanitation services. So obviously we really benefited now from your experience looking at the adaptation challenges. I used to work in Mozambique, so I really love the example. So thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Jay Kaur, Managing Director, the Lightsmith Group, founder and chair of the Global Adaptation and Resilience Investment Working Group. So Jay, the Lightsmith Group has been focusing on expanding available technologies and solutions for climate change adaptation. You chair the Global Adaptation and Resilience Investment Group, which is a private investor-led initiative that was launched at the Paris COP. We would very much like to hear what, from your perspectives, are the barriers to private sector engagement and what needs to be done by the governments, by the multilateral system to mobilize private finance for adaptation. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to be here. Excellencies, delegates, distinguished participants, and friends. Really appreciate the opportunity to present on behalf of private sector investors and the broader community of folks interested in adaptation, investment, and finance. So I'd like to actually describe 3 different topics and then address the challenge of how to mobilize capital for this area. As you know, adaptation finance requires dramatic amounts of increasing scale of deployment of capital. UNEP in 2014 estimated $300 billion per year by 2030 for developing countries alone. And the adaptation finance in the context of COVID-19 report this January reported it's less than 5 to 6% of all climate finance. And the sad fact is less than $500 million per year can be identified in the private sector having anything to do with adaptation finance. So it is a fraction of where it needs to be. The first topic I want to describe is sort of sources of finance and the need for blended strategies here. We at Lightsmith, which is a sustainable private investment fund, are the sponsors of the CRAFT strategy, which is the Climate Resilience and Adaptation Finance and Technology Transfer Facility, which is considered to be the first private investment fund for adaptation and climate resilience. We've mobilized over $125 million of blended finance for that strategy. And on the sources side, very thankful for Ambassador Skoogs and Director Bartram's comments about the EIB and EU strategy here, because on the public sector side of the blended finance equation for that strategy for CRAFT, we are happy to have the European Investment Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Nordic Development Fund, KfW, and the government of Luxembourg, which has been able to together catalyze private sector investment from philanthropy, from the Rockefeller Foundation, from several insurance entities, and from private sector family offices. And we're also looking forward to the potential support of the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund as well in supporting the scaling up of private sector investment in this area. So critical needs at this point in time are substantially in helping to use both public and philanthropic sources of funding to crowd in private sector capital on the sources of capital side of things. At 125 million, that's almost over a quarter of total private finance mobilized for adaptation and resilience. On the uses side of the equation, consistent with many of the top comments that Director Bartram spoke about today and numerous other of the ambassadors described, we are focusing the investment of our capital into data companies and solutions companies. In the private sector, there's capacity to actually help to analyze how climate change will start to impact different parts of society and the economy. We are looking at companies that model physical climate risk, for example, like Jupiter Intelligence and other companies in developing countries, and have made our first investment in a solutions company that's known as Source Global, which has solar-powered hydro panels. These are form factors similar to solar electricity panels, but instead of generating pure clean energy on a sustainable basis, they generate pure drinking water up to 5 liters per day per panel. They're deployed in over 40 countries around the world, and we could scale this technology to address the increasing amount of water scarcity and specific drinking water stress that's being accelerated by the climate change problem. So with even as little as $5 to $20 million of grant financing, for example, we could have a dramatic impact on sourcing 10 to 15 years worth of pure drinking water for small island developing states, and also targeted deployments in lower income countries, in addition to commercially scaling the strategy and solutions. So this is an example of the uses of private sector capital that could be blended on the sources side through the intervention of public and philanthropic activity. The third point I want to make, in addition to, we're at the start of the sources of capital and the uses of capital, so again, blended and data and products being able to scale here, is that the private sector is being mobilized now. We stand ready with technology, with capacity to be a partner to the public sector, and we should be able to consider scaling up dramatically from the 125 million that's been mobilized so far, with a target of 250 or 400 million, to the hundreds of billions of dollars that we're going to need to really address the problem at scale. This is the beginning of the adaptation finance flows. We strongly applaud the efforts of many governments and the UN system to scale up finance in this area to meet the commitments that we've talked about. Secretary General has called for 50% of climate finance to be focused on adaptation. The final thing I'll say is there is a dramatic need not only for blended finance for investment, but for technical assistance. And so the CRAFT strategy calls for the creation of a technical assistance facility to accelerate the deployment of these technologies and solutions, particularly in SIDS and LICs. And we would encourage others to continue to mobilize capital in that way and funding in that way. The final thing I will say is we are the first strategy for private investment in climate resilience and adaptation. We hope to be the first of hundreds or thousands of mobilization efforts where public, private, and philanthropic sources of funding can come together to advance the development of capacity to build the tools, the technologies, and products and services we're going to need as climate adaptation and resilience demands start to accelerate. The last thing I would say is I'm very happy that my 5-year-old did not interrupt this home office presentation, but I also wanted to reinforce that that's what we're really talking about. At the end of 10 years, less than 10 years is 2030, and I'm certain by the time that she is 15 years old, the climate will have changed, even at 1.5 or 2 degrees, quite dramatically. The question we have before us is this: did we make the investments to scale technology, to scale capacity, to scale our action now that 5 and 10 and 20 years from now, we do not look back and say, we wasted time, we wasted energy, we wasted our opportunity to attempt to build the capacity in the public and private sector to address this critical need for the generations to come. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jay, and for that amazing closing of your statement. Thank you. Now I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience, questions to our panelists. If you can indicate your willingness to take the floor in the chat. Okay. So I do have Francesca.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Adriana, and thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you very much. So may I take the floor?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Well, firstly, Malta would like to thank the European Union, Portugal, Antigua, Barbuda, Mozambique, and the EOSIS for today's extremely interesting meeting. Indeed, as we move closer to COP26 in Glasgow, the international community should continue to move towards our climate adaptation strategy goals. And this is why Malta as well, as an EU member state, is proud to form part of the new EU Adaptation Strategy, and which now formulates a key part of the European Green Deal. And to touch upon the adaptation side of today's event, indeed, this should be key and central to our climate action goals, and this cannot be more evident in SIDS. And indeed, the key elements for adaptation are, on one hand, identifying risks and vulnerability, and on the other hand, beating vulnerability with planning for preparedness. And with your indulgence, allow me to share some best practices from my own country, Malta, on what we are doing with regards to planning and mobilizing finance. So on a national level, Malta has adopted its National Climate Adaptation Strategy in 2012. And the focus of the strategy is mainly on addressing risks and financial impacts, as well as identifying the requisite legal framework. And it also touches upon issues pertaining to sustainability, water, agriculture, human health, tourism, and education and awareness, amongst other things. And as the event also said, highlighted, water forms an integral part of any climate adaptation strategy. And this is the case as well for Malta. And a priority project which we have established is called the Net Zero Impact Project in the water sector, which focuses primarily on the water energy nexus, with a view to providing environmentally sustainable water and sanitation services to the affected populations. And this, I believe, could be scalable to other small and island states in particular. And noting how much the provision of such water services is key for limiting as well the impact of COVID-19, the net zero impact concept in the water sector could be an optimal solution. And that is one of the key elements in our adaptation strategy, which indeed I open also the floor to our distinguished panel speakers to elaborate further. And one other thing, Malta has also included adaptation in its low carbon development strategy. For us, we value adaptation to be of equal importance to mitigation. And one final thing on coastal areas, this is indeed another perspective of the same coin. Coastal areas are prime areas where much of the key infrastructure of islands as well as coastal states is located. And we therefore have to address the difficulty faced by small states in deploying alternative sites to replace aging infrastructure, which when coupled with climate-induced impacts such as coastal erosion, we need to address these through long-term approaches. And this is particularly true for essential infrastructure such as energy generation, sewage treatment plants, and desalination plants. And to conclude, allow me to reiterate Malta's commitment to multilateralism. That is, in our case, to be the best framework through which we can channel our climate adaptation efforts. And these efforts can only be bolstered through the appropriate action for SDG implementation, whereby we ensure adaptation, resilience, as well as mitigation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for sharing the best practices in the adaptation strategy of Malta. Unfortunately, I do not have time to go back to the to all panel members to reflect, but I'm going to ask Courtney, it's possible, if there's one more aspect she would like to add after hearing all the other panelists.
Thank you, Adriana. I think from hearing everybody, and especially Malta's intervention, I really appreciate that you brought to the forefront coastal resilience as well, because as you know, for SIDS, over 70% of our development is along the coastline, and that is very important. And investing in climate resilient infrastructure is and will be critical for us in terms of ensuring we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And as we have seen, achieving Sustainable Development Goals requires investment into climate resilient infrastructure. So just to wrap up, I would add that for Antigua and Barbuda, we are really championing that that adaptation gets as much importance as mitigation. And one of the ways in which we have identified, trying to mobilize and get more investment for adaptation is by blending adaptation and mitigation. And we've done that in one of our recent projects funded by the Green Climate Fund, whereby we have some resilient buildings and we embedded mitigation co-benefits in those. So again, just to reiterate some of the points that came across from the others, blending is needed, blending in finance, blending in approaches, the blending of financial instruments, one, but blending in the different approaches of how we approach planning and integrating different components into adaptation projects going forward. Thank you, Adriana, and thank you everyone again for the opportunity, and on behalf of Antigua and Barbuda, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Courtney, and thank you so much to the distinguished panelists. I would like now to invite the UN Secretary General Special Advisor and Assistant Secretary General for Climate Action, Selwyn Hart, to deliver closing remarks. Selwyn.
Thank you so much, Adriana, and I just want to thank you for moderating this fantastic session. I was able to catch quite a bit of it. And at the outset, let me as well congratulate the organizers, the European Union, AOSIS, Antigua and Barbuda, Mozambique, and all of the other colleagues who put this session together. One of the important lessons that we've all learned from the COVID crisis is that investments in preparedness, they save lives and livelihoods, and this must be one of the important lessons that we bring into our efforts to address the climate crisis. The reality is that as we look at the current state of play, we have significant challenges in ensuring that the adaptation and resilience agenda is prioritized. Adaptation and resilience finance continues to lag far behind finance to support mitigation efforts. When one looks at the $100 billion commitment, only 21% of that figure was devoted to adaptation support. That 21% translates into about $16 billion a year. And we know that annual adaptation costs in the developing world are currently estimated at about $70 billion a year. And according to the EU Adaptation Gap Report, that could grow to as much as $300 billion a year by 2030. So we have a significant finance gap, and I don't think that we can, there's no way of sugarcoating this. International climate finance must be significantly scaled up to support adaptation action in developing countries. And even if developing countries had the best adaptation plans and strategies, if they don't have the requisite international finance and support, then these strategies will just be meaningless. The second major challenge, and I've heard it repeatedly, relates to the question of access to finance. At present, SIDS account for a mere 2% of total climate finance flows, or flows to SIDS. That's a mere 2%. And for the least developed countries, it's 14% of total climate finance flows. These are countries on the front lines of the climate crisis. And the world has a moral imperative to ensure that these countries are provided with the access to build resilience and chart a net zero pathway. Some instances, the access issues are based on capacity needs, and others, as a distinguished colleague from Antigua said, it's on issues related to eligibility for concessionary resources. The world, as we head towards Glasgow, we need to solve and urgently solve the access challenges that these countries face. The third challenge that I heard this afternoon was around integrating climate risk across the board, and decision-making, investment decisions, how vulnerable countries and countries in general need to do a much better job at integrating climate risk into decision-making across the board. And it's absolutely essential. I was heartened to hear of the interesting work being done by our colleagues in UNEP, really to support developing countries in developing the tools and instruments to better integrate climate risk into their planning and budgetary processes. Again, this needs to be scaled up significantly. These countries, the SIDS and the LDCs and other vulnerable groups, face the triple crisis of COVID and its economic slowdown, the climate crisis, and ever-mounting debts. I believe that we have a very narrow window of opportunity as we head towards Glasgow, really to ensure that the response from the international community supports these countries in addressing all three crises. And this is why, as one of his three major priorities for Glasgow, the Secretary General has called for securing a major breakthrough on adaptation and resilience as we head towards COP26. And he's been very specific, and the elements associated with this major breakthrough on adaptation and resilience are designed to address these challenges that I mentioned earlier. He's asked donors and the MDBs to allocate at least 50% of their climate finance support towards adaptation and resilience, 50% up from 21%. He's asked for vulnerable developing countries to be provided with the tools to integrate in all policy and investment decision-making climate risk. He's asked for scaling up of the catastrophe risk instruments and tools that have been designed and are working in regions like the Caribbean and in Africa. And he's also asked for the simplification of rules governing access. So finally, as we head towards Glasgow, as I said earlier, we have this narrow window of opportunity, this narrow window of hope. And the European Union has traditionally played an important role in the climate process. As a leader, you're always the first to reach for the stars. The EU was the first to submit its nationally determined contribution, commit to net zero. And now we have 70 countries representing 73% of carbon emissions committing to net zero. And it all started with the European Union. Secondly, the EU has always been one of the champions of ambition. You are one of the first groups to support the small island developing states and the least developed countries in pressing for global mitigation ambition to be pegged at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, the G7 is on board, and this is the global benchmark for meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And third and finally, the EU has always been a bridge builder in terms of reaching over to developing countryside to find compromises to challenges like climate change and ensuring that the multilateral process delivers concrete results. We need the European Union to continue to play this role as we head towards Glasgow. So it's absolutely essential that we remember adaptation and resilience is ultimately about saving lives and livelihoods. And we must do this if we're to leave no one behind. I thank you, and I look forward to continuing to work with all of you as we deliver ambitious outcomes on the road to Glasgow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary General Selwyn, for the inspirational remarks. Thank you to all our distinguished speakers and the participants for this very important and engaging discussion. As I close, allow me to emphasize a key point I hope we take away from this session. As a global community, we have demonstrated in the past 12 months that we can tackle unprecedented epic challenges. Ironically, the pandemic has given us hope. The unparalleled global response to date proves that the SDGs and Paris Agreement are not just a set of visions and targets, they are real, they are practical roadmaps. We know what is needed, but time is short. We just have 9 years to deliver on our global commitments. And now is the time to be bold in how we're going to get where we need to be by 2030, together and with an eye on that future that we want. Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you again to the EU mission to UN, to the missions of Antigua and Barbuda, Mozambique, Portugal, AOSIS, and to all the distinguished speakers. And thank you to the audience for staying with us for this very interesting event. Thank you. Have a very good day.